In the black, silent waters off Guadalcanal, Japanese sailors whispered tales of an American cruiser whose guns spat fire with such speed, it sounded like cloth being torn by a machine gun. They weren't wrong to be afraid. The USS Helena, CL-50, had survived what should have been her death sentence at Pearl Harbor, only to return with a vengeance so fierce it would help rewrite the rules of naval warfare in the Pacific. This is the story of the warship that refused to die, a cruiser whose unrelenting firepower earned her a fearsome nickname, and whose 1,000-man crew forged her legacy with sweat, steel, and sacrifice. In an era when battleships ruled and aircraft carriers were rapidly reshaping the future, the Helena proved that a nimble, determined light cruiser could still change the tide of history. Yet her origins trace back not to gunfire or glory, but to the depths of the Great Depression. As the United States struggled to rebuild its shattered economy, the Navy launched a bold initiative to modernize its aging fleet. Among those designs, the St. Louis-class cruisers emerged, vessels that balanced overwhelming firepower with the agility to flirt with death at sea. When her keel was laid down at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on a freezing December day in 1936, few could have predicted the fate that awaited hull number 50. The men riveting her hull and shaping her plates were building more than just another warship. They were constructing a vessel that would become a symbol of survival, vengeance, and raw American will. Stretching 608 feet from bow to stern, with a slender beam of just 61 feet, the Helena cut a sleek silhouette. But it was her arsenal that made her legendary. 15 6-inch guns mounted in 5 triple turrets gave her a broadside that could unleash unholy destruction. These weren't just standard naval rifles. They were the Mark 16s, capable of cycling 8 to 10 shells per minute per barrel under optimal conditions. The math was staggering, up to 150 shells per minute. No wonder her enemies would come to know her as the machine gun cruiser. Her secondary armament was just as deadly. 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns could bring down aircraft or savage surface targets with equal precision. Beneath her decks, for Parsons turbines harnessed the fury of 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, delivering 100,000 horsepower to 4 bronze screws. She could surge through the sea at 32.5 knots, and with a range of 10,000 nautical miles, no part of the Pacific was beyond her reach. But numbers alone don't tell her story. What made Helena extraordinary was her crew, 868 sailors and officers who turned cold machinery into something close to immortal. Steel and sweat fused aboard her decks, and with every drill, every battle station, they transformed themselves into warriors of the sea. On August 27, 1938, the Helena slid into the East River, christened by the wife of Montana's senator. As the champagne bottle burst across her bow, tradition promised good luck, but whether it delivered would depend entirely on what one considered luck. Her early career played like a peaceful travelogue. After commissioning in September 1939, she steamed south toward Uruguay. There, the crew got their first grim taste of war's reality. In Montevideo Harbor lay the wreckage of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, scuttled after her fateful duel at the Battle of the River Plate. American sailors stood on her decks, gazing at the scorched and twisted hulk, wondering if someday they would meet the same end. But the Pacific was calling, and the Helena answered. By September 1940, she joined the Pacific Fleet, spending the next year in Hawaiian waters. There, she perfected the deadly arts of war. Gunnery drills, fire control exercises, navigation under duress, long days of relentless training that turned young men into lethal professionals. And as 1941 drew to a close, she entered the Mare Island Navy Yard for upgrades. Perhaps the Navy sensed what was coming. Among the changes, she received new 1-inch anti-aircraft guns, giving a seasoned boxer a fresh set of brass knuckles just before a street fight. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Helena lay moored at berth 1010 in Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard. Just across the harbor, the battleship stood proudly along Ford Island. The USS Pennsylvania, pride of the fleet, was originally meant to occupy Helena's berth. But fate intervened. The dry dock needed Pennsylvania more than the pier needed Helena. That one change would prove critical. At 7:57, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Murata led 9 Kate torpedo bombers into the harbor, hunting what they believed to be the Pennsylvania. Through the haze of morning light, Helena's profile looked just enough like a battleship to become the target. Only the lead plane released its payload, a Type 91 torpedo that slashed through the harbor's still waters at 40 knots. The weapon passed under the Oglala, a mine layer tied alongside, and slammed into Helena at frame 75, just below her armor belt. The explosion tore through her engineering spaces with brutal force. Engine room number 1 and boiler room number 2 were instantly consumed, transformed from ordered compartments into mangled, flooded tombs. Seawater poured through the jagged hole, large enough to swallow a truck. But the Helena wasn't done. She fought back. Within 2 minutes, barely 120 seconds, her forward diesel generator roared to life. Power surged through her systems. Her guns, silent a moment before, now turned toward the sky. As Japanese bombers wheeled above for a second pass, Helena's anti-aircraft batteries roared defiantly. Her gunners stood their ground, tracking the sky with calm fury. For bombs fell close, near misses that erupted around her hull, peppering the decks with red-hot fragments. Steel screamed, men shouted, but the cruiser didn't yield. The ship that by all rights should have gone down stayed afloat, held together by grit, training, and the unbreakable resolve of her crew. 40 men lay dead. Another 100 bled in silence below decks. But Helena still floated. In the wardroom, blood mingled with oil as medics worked with frantic precision, fighting to save the wounded. On deck, even as shipmates fell beside them, gunners refused to abandon their mounts. Somewhere above, Japanese pilots radioed in that the cruiser had been sunk. It was a fatal mistake. They hadn't sunk Helena, they had awakened her. The sleeping giant's little sister was now wide awake, and she would remember. In the smoldering aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Helena resembled a critically wounded patient clinging to life. Her hull was torn, her engineering spaces gutted. Water sloshed beneath the decks, and emergency pumps ran without pause, straining to keep her afloat. But somewhere in that broken frame, a heartbeat persisted. She wasn't done, not yet. By December 9th, barely 2 days after the attack, Helena crept into dry dock number 2. Shipyard workers swarmed her like battlefield surgeons, welding and riveting through the night. Steel patches were shaped and slammed into place to seal the gaping wounds. These temporary repairs would hold, they hoped, until she could limp to a proper shipyard. The journey to Mare Island in January 1942 tested every plate, every joint. Pacific swells hammered her patched frame, searching for weakness. Her crew stood ready at damage control, braced for the worst. But the worst never came. Helena held together. She was tougher than anyone expected. At Mare Island, she wasn't just repaired, she was reborn. The Navy had learned bitter, blood-soaked lessons from Pearl Harbor, and Helena would be the first to carry that knowledge back into battle. Her conning tower, which had obstructed vision during night operations, was removed and replaced with an open bridge, sacrificing protection for awareness. The outdated 1-inch Chicago pianos were stripped out. In their place, crews installed 4 quad 40mm Bofors mounts, Swedish design, American steel, and democracy incarnate. But the true revolution came not in steel, but in electrons. Helena was fitted with the brand-new SG surface search radar, an invention so advanced it seemed like science fiction. It could see through fog, smoke, and night, spotting enemy ships long before they came into visual range. Paired with the new FC and FD fire control radars, Helena could now fight in darkness, aiming with unseen eyes. The deadly knife fights of the Solomon Islands would be decided by those who could see first, and Helena would not be blind again. Under the command of Captain Robert H. English and later Captain Charles P. Cecil until September 1942, the crew trained with a feverish discipline. There were debts to settle. Gunners drilled until their muscles moved without thought. Damage control parties rehearsed fires and floods until response was instinct. Each man aboard understood what was coming. The Pacific awaited, and they were not returning as victims. They were returning as predators. In the mess, sailors spoke of payback. In the boiler rooms, engineers coaxed every last revolution from her turbines. They weren't maintaining a warship, they were sharpening a weapon. By July 1942, Helena was ready for war. As she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, bound for the South Pacific, her crew lined the rails. Some waved to wives and sweethearts waiting on the shore. Others looked west, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon, on the enemy who had drawn first blood. The machine gun cruiser was underway. Vengeance was in motion. The Solomon Islands, late 1942, were a sweltering, blood-soaked hell. Jungle, mud, and death. At Guadalcanal, every scrap of ground was paid for in blood. Every mile of sea was fought over in pitch-black chaos. The island's airfield, Henderson Field, was the linchpin, and both sides knew it. Night after night, Japanese cruisers and destroyers tore down the slot, the channel threading between the islands, bombarding the American beachhead and bringing in reinforcements. By early October, Helena was serving in Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Unlike many of his peers, Scott understood the new rules. This wasn't about big gun duels at noon. It was about radar, speed, and overwhelming fire. He trained his task force relentlessly in night fighting tactics. Oddly, though, he chose to fly his flag aboard the USS San Francisco instead of the radar-equipped Helena. That decision would echo in the hours to come. October 11, 1942. American reconnaissance planes spotted a Japanese task force under Admiral Aritomo Goto heading toward Guadalcanal. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, loaded with men and shells. The trap was set. Scott positioned his ships off Cape Esperance, lying in wait. As darkness swallowed the sea, radioman 3rd Class Robert S. Brown sat hunched over Helena's SG radar screen. At 23:25, a faint blip flickered on the scope, then sharpened. Enemy ships, 27,700 yards, and closing. Helena had seen them first. What followed was chaos wrapped in brilliance. Scott, operating blind from the San Francisco, ordered a column turn that, by sheer accident, placed his force perfectly across the enemy's path, crossing their T. It was a textbook ambush, even if unintentional. On Helena's bridge, Captain Gilbert C. Hoover, newly in command since September, watched his radar with growing urgency. Enemy ships were now just 5,000 yards off, so close they could be hit with a stone. But no order to fire had come. The tension was suffocating. Finally, at 23:46, a cryptic Roger from Scott was interpreted as the green light. Helena's turrets were already tracking. They erupted. The first salvo slammed into the Japanese heavy cruiser Furitaka, called Yubari in some accounts, ripping into her bridge, killing Admiral Goto instantly, and gravely wounding her captain. The Japanese admiral died, thinking his own ships had turned on him. The thought that American shells could find him so quickly, so precisely, in total darkness, never crossed his mind. From Helena, fire poured with machine-like precision. Her gunners reached rates of fire that defied belief. Empty brass casings clattered across the deck like golden hail, as loaders moved in perfect, brutal rhythm. She had earned her name. The machine gun cruiser had opened her account. The constant muzzle flashes lit up the night like a thunderstorm at sea, the burning rhythm of her guns painting the darkness with fire. That night, Helena earned the name that would follow her to her grave, the machine gun cruiser. As the flagship burned, the heavy cruiser Furitaka moved in to shield her sister, but instead sailed headfirst into an American steel hurricane. Helena's salvos struck her midsection, hitting her long lance torpedo mounts, Japan's most feared naval weapon. The result was catastrophic. The torpedoes detonated where they sat, turning Furitaka's deck into a volcanic eruption of fire and shrapnel. She burned like a funeral pyre before slipping beneath the waves, her death marked by a plume of oily smoke curling into the stars. It was over in just 14 minutes. Helena alone had fired more than 1,400 shells, her guns so hot that the barrels glowed cherry red. The Battle of Cape Esperance became the first unequivocal American surface victory over the Imperial Japanese Navy. The U.S. Navy had proven that its cruisers could fight and win at night on waters the Japanese had long considered their domain. When morning broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the wreckage of enemy ships bobbed in oily swells. Lifeboats drifted empty. Splintered wood and twisted steel told the tale of sudden death. On board Helena, her crew stood exhausted but alive, a fire burning in their blood. They had tasted victory. It would not be the last. By November 1942, desperation gripped both sides at Guadalcanal. Japan prepared a massive reinforcement convoy. Its aim to break the stalemate once and for all. Helena, now under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67, was once again in the line of fire. But like his predecessor, Callahan chose the San Francisco as his flagship instead of Helena, sacrificing radar superiority for command tradition, a decision that would cost dearly. On the night of November 12th to 13th, Helena's SG radar scope glowed with ominous returns. At 0124 hours, her operators tracked enemy warships entering Iron Bottom Sound, 2 Japanese battleships, Hai and Kirishima, leading a bombardment group. Their mission: reduce Henderson Field to rubble. What followed at 0148 wasn't a naval engagement. It was a close-range brawl between giants. The American and Japanese formations collided at near point-blank range, the night erupting into chaos. Guns fired in all directions. Star shells lit the sky. Searchlights swept wildly across the waves. Tracer fire laced the air in crisscrossing patterns, painting death across the sea. Helena held the edge. Her radar pierced the darkness, allowing her to track and engage targets with clinical precision. Her first salvos raked a ship the crew believed to be a battleship, likely Hai, at a mere 4,200 yards. Explosions rippled up and down the target's hull. Flames licked the sky. Then the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki made a fatal mistake. She illuminated Helena with her searchlight, and in that instant, sealed her fate. Every American ship that could bear brought their guns to bear on the glowing target. Helena's 6-inch salvos joined a cascade of 5-inch and 8-inch rounds, converging on the destroyer in a storm of metal. Akatsuki exploded in a blinding flash, disintegrated, gone in seconds, with nearly all hands lost. Helena swung her turrets and tore into 3 more Japanese destroyers. Her guns fired so rapidly that Japanese survivors would later report believing the Americans had developed a new kind of automatic cannon. One destroyer retreated ablaze, another drifted dead in the water, and a third vanished into the darkness, trailing thick black smoke. Through the chaos, Helena maneuvered like a prizefighter, weaving through the firestorm. Her engineers pushed the turbines to their limits, keeping her dancing through the storm. At one point, San Francisco passed directly between Helena and her target, forcing her gunners to cease fire, a moment that likely prevented friendly casualties. But not all were spared. In the swirling confusion, friendly fire took a grim toll. Admiral Callahan and Captain Casson Young, both aboard San Francisco, were killed by American shells. The night had devoured both friend and foe alike. After 40 brutal minutes, the Japanese force withdrew. The battleship Hai, peppered by dozens of shells, many from Helena, remained behind, her rudders jammed and her decks ablaze. American aircraft finished her the following morning, marking the first time a Japanese battleship was lost in the war. Helena emerged from the melee with 1 sailor dead and minor structural damage. Her gunners had fired over 1,500 rounds in the space of minutes. Her barrels were worn raw, but she had helped shatter the Tokyo Express, preventing the bombardment of Henderson Field and allowing the airbase to survive and launch punishing strikes on Japanese transports in the days ahead. As November 13th dawned, Iron Bottom Sound lived up to its name. New wrecks joined the graveyard below, American and Japanese alike. Helena had survived again, and won, but the toll was rising with each battle. Between these legendary engagements, Helena and her crew endured a relentless routine that tested their endurance as surely as any shell fire. The Solomons were a grinding crucible of sweat, death, and waiting. If enemy fire didn't kill you, the heat, insects, and tropical disease might. The 1,000-yard stare became common among Helena's crew, young men aged overnight by sleepless nights and endless alerts. Life aboard the cruiser followed a brutal rhythm. General quarters at dawn and dusk, the prime hours for submarine attacks. Days spent firing into Japanese jungle strongholds, reducing them to shattered crater fields. Nights patrolling the slot, radar operators squinting at glowing scopes, ears tuned for a whisper of trouble. A strange kind of culture emerged among the crew, a hardened fraternity shaped by danger and routine. Somehow, Helena's laundry still managed to turn out pressed uniforms after battle. The ship's swing band, the Helena Hottentots, played impromptu concerts on the fantail, filling the humid air with jazz renditions of blues in the night. The sound carried across the water to nearby ships, a strange comfort in the heart of a war zone. Food was whatever the supply ships could bring: spam, powdered eggs, coffee so strong it could strip paint. Fresh vegetables became a fading memory. When the ice cream machine worked, it turned out the most coveted treasure in the South Pacific. Men would trade rations, favors, even patrol shifts for a Dixie cup of vanilla. Captain Hoover proved a steady, quietly capable hand. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing survival. He drilled his men hard, but understood the importance of morale. He arranged movie nights on the fantail, boxing matches on the forecastle, small reminders of home, of peace, of what they were fighting to return to. The crew didn't say much when the news came down on November 23, 1942, but the silence spoke volumes. Captain Hoover, the man who had steered them through the fires of Guadalcanal, was relieved of command. The reason? A failure to properly report the torpedoing of the USS Juno. After all they'd endured together, it felt like a bureaucratic betrayal. Hoover was gone, and the ship suddenly felt colder without him. In December, Captain Charles P. Cecil came aboard, stepping into the boots of a legend. He met a battle-hardened crew still loyal to their old skipper and carrying the emotional scars of a relentless campaign. If Cecil wanted their trust, he would have to earn it in steel and salt water. And he would, but it would be through fire. December 1942 and January 1943 blurred into a haze of monotony, exhaustion, and the never-ending call to battle. Helena bombarded Vila and Munda, escorted troop convoys through hostile waters, and chased radar ghosts through the slot. Her crew had developed an almost supernatural awareness. They could read the ocean like a map, the sky like a warning. 1 second could mean life or death. One flash on the water, one streak of light, and everything could end. By February, the Helena was holding together through grit alone. Her turbines wheezed, her guns showed wear in their rifling, and her hull bore the bruises of countless near misses. She needed rest. The journey south to Sydney felt like drifting into heaven. Cold beer, fresh bread, real beds, women who spoke English. For a few fleeting weeks, the men of Helena remembered what it felt like to live, and not just survive. But war has no patience for nostalgia. By April, the machine gun cruiser was back in the Solomons, her barrels relined, her spirit recharged, and her men ready to settle unfinished business. The next target, New Georgia and its airfield at Munda, another stepping stone toward Tokyo, and another crucible of fire. The playbook hadn't changed. Slip into enemy waters under the cover of darkness. Level a shoreline with precision bombardment. Then vanish before dawn brought vengeance from the skies. It was deadly choreography now. Rehearsed. Efficient. Ruthless. On May 13th, Helena led a bombardment group against Vila. Her gunners walked 6-inch shells across fuel depots, troop encampments, and supply stores, carving destruction in rhythmic bursts. The Japanese had wised up by then, moving their assets inland. But even so, Helena's fire found plenty to destroy. In June, the operations intensified. Intelligence crackled with reports of new Japanese convoys, fresh reinforcements steaming south. Every cruiser in the theater went into overdrive to intercept. Helena's crew, veterans of Cape Esperance and Iron Bottom Sound, prepared in silence. Extra ammo came aboard until her magazines swelled. Damage control stations were stocked and double-checked. Letters home were written quietly. Some sealed them and tucked them into their lockers. Just in case. On June 30th, Operation Toenails began, the full-scale invasion of New Georgia. Helena was there. Her 6-inch guns roared, tearing 100-yard swaths of jungle into raw earth, clearing the way for Marines storming ashore at Rendova. Enemy shore batteries barked back, their splashes stepping closer to Helena with every shot, until counter-battery fires snuffed them out like candles in the dark. By July 4th, Independence Day, the cruiser was back in action, pounding Munda Airfield in a blazing fireworks display of anti-aircraft fire and high-explosive bombardment. The Japanese had reinforced their flak positions. The sky turned black with puffs of exploding shells. Helena's own 40mm Bofors responded in defiance, bursts of tracers lacing the heavens like red and white lightning. In that moment, democracy met fascism in a duel of fire and fury. That evening, Helena refueled at Tulagi, taking on oil and ammunition. The break was brief. Radar had picked up movement again. Another Tokyo Express run, fast destroyers running supplies and troops to New Georgia under cover of night. Helena was now part of Task Force 68, and they would intercept in Kula Gulf. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the moon, full and high, turning the water to silver and robbing the Americans of their usual cloak of darkness. Maybe it was the reports of Japanese heavy cruisers joining the convoy. Or maybe it was the gut-level instinct that no ship, no crew, could survive forever. The Helena had danced with death too many times. The odds were catching up. In the early hours of July 6th, Helena slipped into Kula Gulf. Her radar team, the best in the fleet, sat hunched over glowing screens, scanning the northwest. They would find the enemy first. They always did. And her guns would roar with their signature fury. But this time, the enemy would answer. The moon rose like a searchlight over Kula Gulf, casting silver over the Black Sea. Admiral Walden Ainsworth, aboard Honolulu, led the column. Helena followed close behind, her turrets tracking already. This wasn't the usual Tokyo Express. The Japanese had adapted. Admiral Taro Akiyama's force included 10 destroyers, all carrying Type 93 long lance torpedoes. These weren't just weapons. They were sea dragons, able to run 20,000 yards at 49 knots, silent and invisible until impact. At 0136, Helena's radar picked them up, 22,000 yards. But this time, the Japanese saw the Americans too. Their own radar matched the detection window, leveling the playing field in a way that hadn't happened before. Two forces advanced toward one another in the moonlit dark, both knowing this would be no skirmish. It would be slaughter. At 0157, Ainsworth gave the order, open fire. Helena's turrets were already locked in. The first target, the destroyer Niizuki, Akiyama's flagship. Range, 11,000 yards. For Helena's veteran gunners, that was a comfortable shot. The second salvo found her. The next turned her into a floating inferno. Helena's 6-inch shell slammed into the destroyer's midsection, cooking off her torpedoes and blowing apart her bridge. The detonation tore open her hull like paper. Admiral Akiyama was killed instantly. His last glimpse, the muzzle flashes that lit the sea like lightning from a god's hammer. But even as Niizuki died, her sisters had already fired their long lances. 10 destroyers, 10 torpedo spreads, launched in unison before peeling away at flank speed. A textbook, fire and fade strike. They didn't wait for return fire. They didn't need to. They had already pulled the trigger. The torpedoes fanned out across the Gulf like invisible serpents, unseen and deadly, cutting through the water, racing toward the American column. And Helena, still firing, never saw them coming. Nearly 50 torpedoes now knifed through the moonlit waters of Kula Gulf. Invisible killers, each one a 24-foot steel predator armed with a 1,000-pound warhead. Helena, still spitting fire at the destroyer Suzuki's, had no idea what was coming. Her radar-directed salvos found their target, but her own brilliance betrayed her. In the first few minutes of engagement, her gun crews had wisely used flashless powder, the Navy's scarce, carefully guarded solution to night fighting. But when those rounds ran dry, the gunners switched to standard propellant. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Each broadside now illuminated Helena like a lightning storm at sea, a strobing silhouette for Japanese torpedo men to zero in on. At exactly 0203 hours, Helena's charmed life ran out. 3 Type 93 long lance torpedoes struck her in quick, devastating succession. The first hit forward of turret 1, and it was apocalyptic. Some would later argue the forward magazine detonated. Others swore the torpedo's massive warhead simply vaporized everything in its path. Either way, turret 1 was gone, consumed in a towering pillar of flame that rose 200 feet into the night sky, silhouetting the horror for miles. The shockwave thundered through her hull, snapping steel like matchsticks. Below deck, men were hurled against bulkheads, slammed into equipment, thrown like rag dolls in the dark. Before anyone could respond, torpedoes 2 and 3 slammed home amidships, under her armor belt, straight into her belly. The explosions broke her keel, the ship's very spine, flooding engine rooms instantly. Her mighty turbines screamed, then fell silent as seawater drowned them. Electrical systems failed, lights flickered, and a suffocating blackness fell across the ship's interior. Fire flickered against bulkheads. Men stumbled through smoke, oil, and rising water. Captain Cecil didn't hesitate. He knew the ship was dying. With her keel broken, Helena was jackknifing, bending at the center. He gave the order no captain ever wants to hear: abandon ship. But her gunners refused to die quietly. Even as the cruiser listed and began to buckle, her aft turrets continued firing. Turret 4 fired until the handling rooms were swallowed by seawater. Turret 5's crew, knowing the end had come, manually trained and fired their guns until the ship's tilt made elevation impossible. Then the ship cracked apart. The bow section, everything forward of Turret 2, had already vanished beneath the waves. The midsection, including the bridge and engineering spaces, rolled over and sank within minutes. But the stern, the last proud fragment of Helena, stayed afloat, carrying nearly 400 men with it. In the oily, debris-choked water, hundreds of men now fought for their lives. Some wounded, all disoriented. The battle was over. Survival had just begun. From the darkness, the destroyer Nicholas surged forward, her crew risking torpedo strikes to reach the scene. While her guns fired on approaching Japanese destroyers, sailors lined the rails, reaching out, pulling men aboard in oily hand-over-hand chains. They fought for every soul they could save. By dawn on July 6th, Kula Gulf was littered with wreckage, bodies, and hope. Helena's bow and stern still floated, grotesque life rafts carrying hundreds of dazed survivors. But daylight brought a new threat: Japanese aircraft. Admiral Ainsworth faced a brutal decision. His radar showed more enemy ships nearby. His cruisers were vulnerable. If he stayed, he could lose more ships, more men. He gave the order to withdraw. Nicholas and Radford had already pulled 739 men from the water overnight. Their crews worked until their hands bled, forming human chains, dragging survivors up ladders, across oily decks. But over 100 men were still in the sea. Ainsworth had to leave them behind. For the men still adrift, July 6th became a crucible of human endurance. Under the merciless tropical sun, their skin blistered. Salt water burned open wounds. Sharks, drawn by the scent of blood and death, circled slowly. Survivors banded together, sharing what few life rafts remained, keeping the wounded afloat. On the floating stern, Lieutenant Commander John L. Chu took command. He rationed out the remaining food and water, organized watches, and maintained discipline. He turned wreckage into order. When Japanese floatplanes swept low to strafe them, the men dove beneath twisted steel, hiding in the broken bones of their ship. That night, 2 American destroyers tried to return, but Japanese warships forced them back. The survivors spent another hellish night at sea, their numbers dwindling. Some slipped beneath the waves quietly. Others were lost to sharks. Hope became harder to hold. Then, help arrived from the shadows of the jungle. Reverend A.W. E. Sylvester, a coast watcher on Vela La Vela Island, spotted the floating wreckage and radioed the survivors' position. Native islanders risked their lives to bring food, guide survivors through the bush, and outmaneuver Japanese patrols. They sheltered the wounded and helped hide the rest. On the nights of July 7th and 8th, destroyers Nicholas and Jenkins, along with fast transports Dent and Waters, returned under cover of darkness. Whaleboats and rubber rafts were lowered. Searchlights remained dark. By lantern light and whispers, they pulled 165 more men from the floating stern and surrounding waters. As the last man was hauled aboard, the Helena's stern began to list, and finally sank, as though she had waited to make sure her crew was safe before she let go. But 88 men had drifted to Japanese-held La Vela. For a week, they evaded patrols, moving at night, surviving on coconuts, rainwater, and hope. Native scouts guided them north. They hid in caves, in groves, beneath trees that swallowed sound. On July 16th, for destroyers, Taylor, Morris, Gwynn, and Ralph Talbot raced into hostile waters in daylight to pull them out. The rescue was fast, bold, and successful. Out of 868 men who had gone to war aboard Helena, 700 returned. The others, 168 souls, were lost in the darkness of Kula Gulf or faded in its aftermath. But they were not forgotten. They were saved by the bravery of destroyer crews who defied the odds, by coast watchers who stayed behind enemy lines, by islanders who risked death to save strangers, and by their own refusal to surrender. Helena's story could have ended that night. Another name etched on a war memorial. Another ship claimed by the cruel Solomon tides. But her legacy survived. In the fire she rained down, the lives she saved, and the legend she became. But legends don't go quietly into the deep. In Navy wardrooms and smoky enlisted clubs from Pearl Harbor to Pensacola, the stories lingered. Tales of the cruiser that fired so fast. Her salvos sounded like thunder stitched with lightning. A ship whose guns could speak with the fury of a battleship, yet turned tighter than a destroyer. They called her the machine gun cruiser, and among the men who served her, the name was spoken with a mix of pride, awe, and reverence. The Navy took notice, too. USS Helena, CL-50, was awarded 7 battle stars for her service, each one hard-earned in the crucible of the Pacific. She became the first ship in Navy history to receive the newly established Navy Unit Commendation. Her citation named the turning points of the early Pacific War, Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, and Kula Gulf, and etched her name into naval history alongside them. But Helena's influence extended far beyond her awards. Her pioneering use of radar-directed gunnery in night combat rewrote the Navy's tactical playbook. Admirals who once dismissed electronics now demanded SG radar on every warship. The deadly mistake of running out of flashless powder became a case study. Damage control manuals were revised based on the lessons of her sinking. Helena didn't just fight, she taught. For decades, she lay silent at the bottom of Kula Gulf. Her final position unknown, her story passed from sailor to sailor like sacred lore. Her survivors, now old men with silver hair and sun-spotted hands, gathered at reunions, their numbers shrinking with each passing year. But their memories stayed sharp. They remembered the smell of gunpowder, the recoil under their feet, the sound of her turrets, and the faces of the friends who never came home. And then, in April 2018, the silence was broken. Paul Allen's research vessel RV Petrel located Helena 2,800 feet below the surface of Kula Gulf. The deep-sea cameras swept across a ghostly silhouette, her hull battered but unmistakable. The number 50 was still visible on her stern. Her turrets were frozen in time, trained out, as if waiting for another broadside. The sea had claimed her, but not erased her. For the men who had lived, and the families of those who hadn't, it was a final chapter written at last. A grave marked, a legacy confirmed. But Helena is more than a war grave. She is a monument to what American resolve looks like in steel and smoke. She represents the teenagers who left the Bronx or Birmingham and became sailors. The machinists in Brooklyn who built her with rivets and purpose during the Great Depression. The officers who learned to command not from textbooks, but from the chaos of night battles and torpedo attacks. She represents a time when survival was victory, and courage came in 6-inch salvos fired into the dark. From her birth in the icy yards of Brooklyn, to her resurrection after Pearl Harbor, to her death in the furnace of Kula Gulf, Helena embodied the brutal, determined spirit of the Pacific War. She wasn't the biggest ship, or the flashiest, but she fought harder, fired faster, and bled more steel into the sea than most. Even in her final hour, as her decks broke apart beneath her crew's boots, Helena kept fighting. Her guns didn't go silent until the sea itself flooded their breeches. The Japanese feared her, and rightly so. To them, she was a demon in the dark. To the men who crewed her, she was home. And in the long annals of naval history, USS Helena stands not just as a warship, but as a symbol of firepower, resilience, and the kind of courage that doesn't flinch, even when surrounded by death. She rests now beneath the waves, her turrets draped in coral, her passageways patrolled by fish instead of sailors. But her name still echoes in Navy history, in the hearts of her crew, and in the steel will of those who carry forward her memory. She was one hell of a fighting ship, and even in silence, she still watches.